at your fucking face. Fucking.
What if the man who carved his name into Hollywood's gold was hiding a secret list of stars he despised? Imagine walking into the 1993 Oscars, surrounded by glittering producers and winning actors, only to see Clint Eastwood standing stone-faced in the Four Seasons lobby. A rising actor throws a cheap impersonation of the legendary director. The room erupts with laughter, except for Eastwood, who takes a sip, nods at the bartender, and walks out into the night, leaving silence that stunned everyone in the room. Decades later, at 94, the legend finally cracks his shell. In a few rare, unscripted moments of honesty, Clint Eastwood has revealed the 5 celebrities who earned his deepest disdain and the stories that explain why. Join us as we pull back the curtain on Eastwood's surprising list and uncover the drama that made Hollywood's biggest names rethink their careers. At the 1993 Oscars, the Four Seasons lobby was a tableau of glamour and tension. Armani-draped producers and recent laureates exchanged whiskey and whispered rumors, while a lone figure, a granite-clad director, lingered near the grand piano. Clint Eastwood's presence was almost an afterthought to the glittering affair, yet his eyes scanned the room with an unspoken scrutiny. The crowd moved in waves of applause and laughter, unaware of the quiet storm brewing in the center of the floor. A rising young actor, his name still echoing in the corridors of Hollywood, captured the room's attention with a comedic riff, a cheap impersonation of the very director who watched him with unblinking focus. The laughter that bubbled from the other attendees fell flat against Eastwood's stone face. He finished his drink, offered a single, perfunctory nod to the bartender, and slipped out without looking back. No words, no exchange, just the weight of a silence that felt both final and alive. For years, whispers threaded through the industry, the hush of that evening becoming a myth. What did Clint hear? What comment had slipped through the cracks? The name of that actor vanished from Warner Brothers casting sheets the following month as if erased by an invisible hand. No public statement, no interview, no social media rants. Clint's silence was absolute, a curtain that closed on that night's drama. Yet the silence began to fracture at age 94. When the legend finally allowed himself to speak, a pattern emerged. A list of 5 celebrities who earned his disdain. Those who, for some reason, failed to respect his artistic creed or simply misread his intent. Each name carried a story of conflict, a moment where a man who lived by a personal code met an individual who crossed that line. The first name on that list was a documentary filmmaker who sought to carve a niche by mocking the very principles that had guided Eastwood's career. Michael Moore. The tension between them was palpable, an undercurrent that had begun to swell as Moore's documentaries started to hit the headlines. The stage of the National Board of Review Awards in 2005 became the setting for a confrontation that would define their relationship. Clint Eastwood took the podium and, with the poise of a man who had already seen the world's wars, delivered a line that reverberated through the hall. Michael Moore and I actually have a lot in common. We both appreciate documentaries, but if he ever shows up at my front door with a camera, I'll kill him. The room fell into a hush, then erupted in nervous chuckles and whispered gasps. Eastwood's eyes remained steady. He did not flinch. He did not soften his expression. He did not even smile. He simply stood there, a quiet, defiant figure, as if he had just spoken a warning to a ghost. The tension hung like gunpowder, the audience feeling the shift, the line drawn in the sand that had never been crossed again. But that single remark was only the tip of a deeper story. Michael Moore's work had become a lightning rod for controversy. His 2004 documentary, Fahrenheit 9/11, was a blistering critique of the Bush administration's handling of the post-9/11 war. It won awards, turned heads, and drew the ire of those who felt the film betrayed American patriotism. For Eastwood, who had grown up admiring the quiet sacrifice of World War II heroes, Moore's work felt like a cheap shot wrapped in self-promotion. It was not criticism, it was betrayal. It struck a chord in the heart of a man who had just finished directing $1 Billion Baby and was on the cusp of releasing Flags of Our Fathers, a film that explored American identity, sacrifice, and pain, not for headlines, but for history. Eastwood's response to Moore was not immediate public condemnation, but a quiet, calculated distance. The director's career took a turn toward projects that celebrated the quiet dignity of the American experience, a counterpoint to Moore's sensationalism. Eastwood's own films, from Unforgiven to American Sniper, leaned into themes of moral complexity, the costs of violence, and the fragile humanity of those who carry the weight of a nation's conscience. In contrast, Moore's documentaries had a sharper focus on exposing perceived injustice, often at the expense of nuance. Behind the scenes, the two men seemed to share a respect that was, at best, begrudging. The world of filmmaking is one where mutual admiration can coexist with fierce rivalry. Yet for Eastwood, the line was never to be crossed. He was a man who had lived by a code, a personal creed that valued integrity and restraint. When a critic in the public eye seemed to attack that code, whether through an irreverent joke or a scathing documentary, Eastwood responded not with a flurry of public statements, but with a quiet, resolute silence that said, "I will not let you tarnish what I have built." The audience left that night with a new understanding of the quiet force that governs Eastwood's career. He was no longer just a director or an actor. He was a guardian of a certain moral architecture, a man who would not let his principles be trampled by anyone who did not understand their weight. And while the world might still wonder about the silent exits and the names that faded from casting sheets, the pattern was clear. Eastwood would not forgive those who insulted him, disrespected his vision, or thought he had forgotten his own code. He would quietly, coldly, permanently remove them from the narrative of his life, allowing their presence to be a memory rather than a reality. Clint's eyes narrowed, not toward the glint of a camera, but toward the very idea that his work was being used as a prop in someone else's argument. When Michael Moore's documentaries began to surface on every network, Eastwood saw them as a mockery of the stories he'd spent decades telling on celluloid. The director's silence was deliberate. He preferred to erase the echo of criticism rather than amplify it. But Moore was not the only one who would push against his quiet resolve. The next spark came from a filmmaker who believed in the power of provocation. Spike Lee's 2008 film, A Battle Over History, had taken aim at Clint Eastwood's Flags of Our Fathers and Letters from Iwo Jima, accusing him of whitewashing the narrative and silencing the Black Marines who had fought on the island. Lee's accusations were direct. "You can't ignore those men," he declared, calling on viewers to reconsider the absence of representation in the two-film package. He framed the omission as a betrayal, a failure to acknowledge the full spectrum of sacrifice that defined the American experience. Eastwood, who had always preferred to keep his craft separate from public spectacle, was incensed. He did not answer with measured interviews or diplomatic statements. Instead, he fired back in a voice that sounded more like a warning from the frontier than a response from a Hollywood veteran. "A guy like you should shut your face," he said, a line that was both a refusal to engage and a declaration of his own disdain for what he saw as an overreach into his artistic territory. The exchange spiraled into headlines, and the Hollywood press, which had largely been neutral until then, erupted into a flurry of speculation about a brewing feud between two titans of the industry. The fallout was more than a media circus. In the wake of the dispute, other actors and directors weighed in. Some condemned Lee for what they saw as an unnecessary politicization of cinema, while others applauded him for pushing Eastwood to confront the gaps in his storytelling. The conversation that had started in a film festival had now become a national debate on representation, history, and the responsibilities of filmmakers. Despite the intensity of the public discussion, Eastwood never clarified his remarks in any interview. That silence was a deliberate act, a way of saying that his work was his own and should not be dissected by outside voices. While the world watched this duel of words, Eastwood was already preparing for a new project that would test his patience in a different way. In 2011, he cast Leonardo DiCaprio in the crime thriller J. Edgar. The choice was a collision of eras. DiCaprio, the method actor known for his intensity and commitment to emotional truth, and Eastwood, the seasoned director whose philosophy centered on speed, silence, and control. On set, the tension was palpable from day one. DiCaprio's approach to the character involved deep dives into internal monologues and rehearsals that stretched into the early hours, seeking to unearth layers that even the director could not anticipate. Eastwood, in contrast, favored the one-take style that had defined much of his earlier work. He wanted to capture the rawness of a moment before the actor could overthink it. The two styles collided like oil and water. DiCaprio, accustomed to dissecting every nuance, found Eastwood's insistence on immediacy stifling. Eastwood, in turn, felt that DiCaprio's meticulousness was a threat to the rhythm of the shoot. What began as a professional disagreement grew into a quiet storm that rattled the set. Scenes were cut, scenes were reshot, and a deep divide formed between the two stars. Yet the clash on the set was not just about technique. It was a confrontation between two philosophies of filmmaking. Eastwood believed that cinema should be an honest reflection of the human condition, stripped of unnecessary embellishment. He trusted his actors to bring their own truth into the frame without constant guidance. DiCaprio, however, felt that the only way to achieve that truth was through exhaustive preparation, method acting that demanded the audience's empathy and the director's patience. The friction that arose was less about the craft and more about the way each man defined authenticity. The drama between Eastwood and DiCaprio, however, never reached the level of public outcry that the Spike Lee incident had. The director's silence once again prevailed, his disapproval expressed through tight control of the set rather than a televised statement. The audience watching the film's release could not see the undercurrents, but those who worked alongside Eastwood could feel the ripple of his decision to keep his frustrations private. This pattern of silent retaliation became a hallmark of Eastwood's career. He would not allow himself to be dragged into public feuds. He would instead use his influence and authority to quietly remove the source of contention from his sphere. The pattern of confrontation and quiet retreat was not limited to directors or actors. In the broader industry, Eastwood's reputation as a silent eraser grew. Colleagues who found themselves at odds with his uncompromising vision often found themselves sidelined, replaced, or simply absent from the projects they once contributed to. For those who dared to challenge him, the consequences were clear. The film, the budget, and sometimes even their career could be undone in a single decision. The industry began to understand that Eastwood's code was not just a personal philosophy, but a living, breathing entity that governed his every move. And so, the narrative of Clint Eastwood's relationships with the people who stood in his way became a story of power, of art, and of the unspoken rules that govern the world of cinema. He built a career on quiet authority, choosing to erase dissent rather than amplify it. His reactions to Michael Moore, Spike Lee, and Leonardo DiCaprio were not mere reactions. They were extensions of a deeper conviction that the stories he told had to remain true to his vision, untainted by outside noise. The result was a legacy that was both admired and feared, a testament to a man who preferred the silence of his own mind over the clamor of the public eye. In the end, the most powerful thing about Eastwood's approach was not the controversies themselves, but how he chose to handle them. He did not let criticism erode his work. He let it carve a sharper focus into the essence of his storytelling. Those who worked with him learned that in his world, silence was not the absence of sound, but a deliberate strategy to protect the integrity of his art. The director's name became synonymous with this quiet power, and the industry, in its own way, respected the boundaries he set. Through these episodes, Moore's documentaries, Lee's accusations, DiCaprio's method acting, Eastwood continued to cement his place not only as a filmmaker, but as an icon of uncompromising silence and unwavering principle. When the cameras started rolling on the next chapter of his career, the studio set felt colder than the dusty streets of the western towns Eastwood had so often portrayed. The co-star who would become the focus of this quiet battlefield was none other than a figure who shared the same gravity on screen as Eastwood, a man whose presence matched the director's, who could hold his own in a line of dialogue, and whose reputation was built on the same blend of rugged poise and unspoken depth. They met for the first time on the set of a sprawling, character-driven drama that would test both of their limits. Eastwood, true to form, commanded the set with a hush that would have made the sound of a single drop feel like thunder. He moved from one shot to the next with a calm, almost clinical precision that left little room for improvisation. The co-star, accustomed to a more collaborative approach, found himself stepping into a world where every gesture and pause was premeditated, where the director's word carried the weight of finality. The first days were marked by a subtle dance. Eastwood's silence was not a sign of disdain, it was an intentional shield, a deliberate distancing that allowed him to focus on the art without distractions. The co-star, however, sensed the invisible barrier and felt the frustration of being unable to share in the creative process. Conversations were brief, answers were swift, and there was an unmistakable sense that the director's vision was being filtered through an iron gate. Yet, within this austere environment, the co-star began to see the cracks in the myth of Eastwood's invincibility. He observed the way the director would quietly redirect a scene, how he would call cut and then immediately move on, leaving no room for debate. This silent methodology, while efficient, left the co-star feeling as if he were a mere prop, his talent reduced to a line that had to fit into a larger framework. It was on a late evening, after a grueling shoot, that the tension found its voice. The co-star, tired and aching, approached Eastwood's trailer for a quick word. Eastwood was inside, his face a mask of concentration as he edited a take. The co-star cleared his throat, attempting to break the silence that had long defined their relationship. "I think we could explore that line a bit more," he suggested, his voice steady but edged with urgency. Eastwood, unruffled, glanced at him, his eyes reflecting a flicker of irritation. "We'll talk about it in the next session," he replied, and in a single gesture shut the door. The next day, a new routine emerged. Eastwood began to invite the co-star to his private editing room, not to discuss the script, but to observe. He would pause a scene, then simply say, "Watch how I cut." The co-star watched as the director's method unfolded. Shots cut for rhythm, dialogue trimmed for impact. He realized that the director's silent authority was not an act of disregard, but a disciplined approach to storytelling. Yet, as the days turned into weeks, the co-star's frustration grew. He was left to question why his interpretations of a character were not heard, why his contributions seemed to be overwritten by a script that was already rigidly mapped out. In the midst of this growing dissonance, the studio decided to film a promotional interview for the upcoming release. Eastwood, ever the master of silence, agreed to a brief on-camera session. The co-star, in his role, was asked to answer a question about the film's thematic core. He stepped forward, ready to share his insights. The interviewer's question, "What does this film say about human resilience?" seemed innocuous, but the co-star sensed the weight of the moment. He began to speak, weaving a narrative that highlighted the character's inner struggles, the subtle nuances of the script, and the emotional depth he believed the film conveyed. His words, however, were not enough. In the very next moment, Eastwood leaned forward, his jaw tightening, and spoke without looking at the camera. "It's a story about choices," he said, his voice low and deliberate. The co-star felt the sharp sting of being eclipsed. a silence that could no longer be ignored. The unforgettable moment arrived at the film's premiere, where the audience was hushed, the spotlight focused on the stars. The co-star was to receive an award for his performance. As he stepped onto the stage, the applause swelled, and the applause was a roar that reverberated through the theater. He accepted the award with a gracious smile, his eyes briefly meeting Eastwood's, who stood in the wings. The director's face was inscrutable, but when the host asked, "How would you describe your collaboration with Mr. Eastwood?" the co-star answered with a calm, measured tone, acknowledging the director's disciplined vision. Eastwood, however, simply nodded, offering a faint, almost imperceptible smile that conveyed a mixture of approval and a silent warning. After the ceremony, backstage chatter swirled. The co-star found himself surrounded by reporters, each eager to know more about the dynamic between him and Eastwood. He declined to delve into the details, recognizing that the director's preference for silence would not yield any insight. The co-star's frustration turned into a quiet resolve. He decided to carry forward the lessons he had learned, both from the director's meticulous precision and his own need for creative expression. In the months that followed, he began to carve a niche that was independent yet respectful of the legacy he had shared with Eastwood. Meanwhile, Eastwood maintained his trademark silence. He did not issue statements, did not engage in public feuds. He let the silence speak for him, a final word that, in its own way, carried more power than any spoken apology. He continued to direct, to choose projects that allowed him to maintain his artistic control. Industry insiders, however, took note of the pattern. A silent confrontation seemed to be the only currency that could hold sway over Eastwood's reputation. His colleagues, Leonardo DiCaprio, Seth Rogen, Michael Moore, Spike Lee, and even the co-star, were all drawn into a narrative that celebrated restraint over rhetoric. Thus, the quiet feud with the co-star became another chapter in Eastwood's saga. It was a story of an equal who could match the director's stature, a story that unfolded not through words but through the space between them. In the end, the director's silence, his steadfast refusal to engage in noise, became his most enduring message. The co-star's journey, from frustration to acceptance, echoed the very ethos that defined Eastwood's career, a relentless pursuit of artistry tempered by the wisdom that sometimes the most profound conversations happen without a single word. Unforgiven arrived on the studio lot like a quiet storm, its dusted spurs and muted sunlight promising a fresh take on the Western myth. It was the first time in years that Clint Eastwood had opened a door to a collaborator who could rival his own legend. Gene Hackman, whose career had been built on sharp wit and a willingness to push boundaries, stepped into the frame as both equal and foil. Their partnership seemed to promise a cinematic firework, but the set quickly revealed the tension that would define the film's legacy. Hackman carried a reputation that was half brilliance, half unpredictability. In the 1970s and 80s, he had shattered archetypes, moving from the quiet menace of The French Connection to the raw vulnerability of The Royal Tenenbaums. Directors had learned to keep his hands on the script, but it was his own fire that made him a difficult yet irresistible presence. When he entered the world of West's controlled silence, the mismatch was almost inevitable.